I've buried a wife. I've buried friends. I even buried a good horse once and felt worse about it than I'd like to admit. But in 40 years on this land, I never saw anything that broke me open the way 3 motherless children did, the night a stranger came up our road in a borrowed coat. The man who sent for her called it a marriage. The town called it a mercy. The children, well, the children didn't call it anything at first. They just watched her the way you watch weather coming over the ridge, trying to guess if it'll pass you by or take the roof off your house. She came expecting to be hated. She'd been told what she was, a girl nobody could keep, handed off like a debt that finally found someone willing to settle it. She walked into that cold house with her chin up and her hands shaking and a whole speech ready about duty and not getting in anyone's way. She never got to give that speech. Because what those 3 children did on her first night, what I watched them do with my own 2 eyes, was the strangest, gentlest, most heartbreaking welcome I ever witnessed. And it had nothing to do with what any of us expected. If you've ever been the one left behind, or the one nobody chose, or the one who came late to a family already cracked down the middle, stay with me. This one's for you. Here's how it happened. The wagon came up the road at the worst possible hour, which is to say the hour right before supper, when everybody's tired and nobody's got the heart left to be kind. I was at the corral fence counting. That's a thing I do, I count. Cattle fence posts days till the first frost, the number of times Caleb Hartley filled his cup and didn't drink it. My name's Eli Mercer, and I've been foreman on the Hartley place going on 11 years, and somewhere along the line my head turned into a ledger that won't shut up. I had 31 head in the near pasture, and I'd counted them 4 times because counting was easier than thinking about what was coming up the road. What was coming up the road was a girl. She sat next to Old Dutch on the wagon bench in a coat that wasn't hers, too big in the shoulders. A man's coat. Somebody'd thrown it over her at the depot so she wouldn't freeze. Her hands were folded in her lap like she'd been told to keep them that way. She didn't look at the house. She looked at the mountains behind it, the way a person looks at something they're trying to memorize because they figure they won't see it long. I knew her name before she said it. Adeline Crane, 19 years old, sent out from Ohio by a marriage broker who took a fee from a widower's hand and called it Providence. Caleb hadn't wanted to do it. I want that on the record since I'm the one telling this. He'd sat at the kitchen table 3 nights running with the letter in front of him, turning it over, not reading it, and finally he'd said to me low, like it cost him something, "I can't do it alone anymore, Eli." The little one won't speak. Ruth's raising the other 2 and she's 12. I'm losing them. And then he'd signed his name to a thing that's supposed to be about love and was really just about not drowning. So Adeline Crane, given. She climbed down off the wagon without waiting for a hand, which I noticed, stood in the yard in that big coat with a single carpet bag, and looked at Caleb Hartley for the first time. Caleb's a big man, quiet in the wrong way, not peaceful quiet, but the quiet of a house with the shutters nailed up. 2 winters a widower and he wore it on him like a second coat he couldn't take off. He had his hat in his hands. He didn't smile because he'd forgotten how, but he tried, and the trying was almost worse. "Miss Crane," he said. "Mr. Hartley." Her voice was steadier than her hands. And that was the wedding, near enough. The preacher came 2 days later and said the words over them in the front room with me and Dutch as witnesses, and the 3 children lined up against the wall like fence posts, but the real marriage happened right there in the yard. 2 people who'd run out of other choices, agreeing to stand in the same wreckage and see if they could make it hold. But I'm getting ahead. Let me tell you about the children because they're the heart of this thing, and I won't have you thinking they were cruel. They weren't cruel. They were grieving, which is a different animal and a meaner one. Ruth was the eldest, 12 going on 40. She had her mother's dark hair and her father's flat stare, and she'd been keeping that house alive with her own 2 hands since Mara died, cooking what she could, scrubbing what she could reach, putting her brother and sister to bed and lying to them about when things would get better. When Adeline stepped into the yard, Ruth looked at her the way a sentry looks at the dark. not hateful, watchful, already counting the cost. Asa was 9, and Asa was angry. He'd been angry for 2 years. He was angry at the fever, at God, at his father for not fixing it, at the world for going on turning when it had no right to. When he saw Adeline, he turned and walked into the barn and didn't come out till dark. I found him later sitting in the loft with his knees up, and I didn't say anything, and neither did he, and that was the kindest conversation we'd had in months. And then there was Nell, 5 years old, round face, scabbed knees, a rag doll she carried everywhere with one eye missing. Nell had not spoken a word in 2 years, not since the morning they told her mama was gone. The doctor in town said there was nothing wrong with her throat, that some children just go quiet when the world gets too loud, and that she'd talk again when she was ready. 2 years she'd been not ready. She communicated in tugs and points and the occasional drawing scratched in the dirt with a stick. Caleb would have given the whole ranch to hear her say one word, any word. That first evening, Adeline came into a kitchen that hadn't seen a grown woman in 2 years. I was at the table because Caleb asked me to be. He didn't trust himself to fill the silence, and he was right not to. Adeline stood in the doorway with her carpet bag still in her hand, and she looked around at the place. The unswept corners, the dishes Ruth couldn't quite reach to put away right, the empty rocking chair by the stove that nobody sat in and nobody had moved, a house holding its breath. And I watched her see all of it, and I watched her decide something. She set her bag down. She took off the borrowed coat and hung it on the peg by the door like she meant to come back to it. And she said to the room, to nobody, to all of them, "I'm not here to take anybody's place. I know whose chair that is. I'll not sit in it." Ruth's eyes came up off the floor, just for a second, then back down. It was a small thing, but I'd been watching that girl raise her siblings on grief and willpower for 2 years, and I'd never once seen anybody hand her a single thing she didn't have to fight for. And here was this stranger, handing her that, "I see your dead mother, and I won't pretend her away," without being asked. Supper was quiet. Adeline didn't try to fill it. She ate what Ruth had made, a thin stew, more water than meat, because that's what there was, and she said it was good, and she meant it in a way that wasn't pity, and Ruth heard the difference. Asa didn't come in. Nell ate 3 bites and watched the new woman over the rim of her cup with both eyes wide, doll clutched against her chest. Caleb couldn't look at any of them. He looked at his hands. After, Adeline asked where she'd sleep, and there was a terrible little pause, because of course nobody had thought it through, because nobody thinks anything through when they're just trying to survive the week. Caleb started to say something about the back room and stopped. The back room had been theirs. His and Mara's. "The back room's fine," Adeline said quietly before the silence could get any worse. "I'll make up the small bed there. You needn't." She didn't finish. She didn't have to. She wasn't going to share his bed, and they both knew it, and she let him off the hook of saying so, and I saw something in Caleb's shoulders come down half an inch. Relief and shame at the relief. I went out to the bunkhouse around 9. I remember it was clear and cold, and there was a thin moon. I remember standing in the yard and looking back at the house with its one lit window and thinking, God help that girl. She's walked into a house full of ghosts, and she doesn't even get a wedding night that isn't a duty. She gets 3 children who will hate her for not being their mother. She gets a man who can't say 2 words. She gets the worst bargain a woman ever got handed, and she walked into it with her chin up like it was nothing. I had her figured for gone by spring. I had the whole thing figured for a slow disaster. I want to tell you I knew better. I didn't. I'm just the foreman. I count things. And the thing I counted wrong that first night was the children. Because around midnight, I know it was midnight because my watch had stopped at midnight 9 years back, the night my own Sarah died, and I never fixed it, and I'd looked at its dead face out of habit around midnight. I couldn't sleep, and I went up to the house to bank the kitchen stove so the pipes wouldn't freeze. And in the hall, outside the door of the back room where Adeline slept, I found all 3 of them. Ruth, Asa, and Nell. They dragged their blankets out of their beds, and they were lying in a row on the cold floorboards across the threshold of her door. asleep. Ruth with one arm thrown over the little one. Asa, angry Asa, who hadn't let anybody near him in 2 years, curled up with his back against the door like he was holding it shut, or holding something in. I stood there in the dark with a dead watch in my hand, and I did not understand what I was looking at. It didn't look like hate. It looked like guarding. But I couldn't have told you that night whether they were guarding her or guarding themselves against her. And I went back to the bunkhouse without banking the stove, and I lay awake till dawn, and for the first time in 2 years on that grieving place, I felt something move in the dark that I couldn't name. I didn't say anything about the children in the hall. Not to Caleb, not to anybody. It felt like a thing I'd seen by accident, the way you sometimes see a wild creature do something tender when it doesn't know you're watching, and you keep it to yourself because saying it out loud would spend it. But I watched after that. Lord, did I watch. The next morning Adeline was up before anybody, and she didn't know I'd seen the children, so she didn't know what it meant when she found their 3 empty beds and 3 children already back where they belonged, pretending. She just started working. And here's the thing about Adeline Crane that the town and the marriage broker and even Caleb had all missed, because they'd only ever seen her as a problem to be solved. The girl was made of iron and didn't know it yet. She'd grown up the eldest of 7 in a house that lost its money slow, then fast. She knew hunger. She knew how to make a meal out of nearly nothing and a coat last 3 winters and a hard word roll off her back. When her father couldn't feed them all, she was the one they could spare, and they'd told her so, and she'd carried that, "You're the one we could give away," all the way across the country in a borrowed coat. I learned all this in pieces over months because she didn't complain and she didn't explain. She just worked. That first week she didn't try to mother those children. That was the smartest thing she ever did, though I don't think it was a strategy. I think she just knew in her bones that you can't replace a thing by pretending to be it. So she didn't reach for Nell. She didn't correct Ruth. She didn't crowd Asa. She just made the house a little warmer every day, and let them come to her or not. She scrubbed the corners Ruth couldn't reach and never made a word of it so Ruth wouldn't feel the lack of her own efforts. She mended Asa's torn shirts in the night and left them folded on his bench without comment so he could pretend he hadn't noticed somebody'd cared for him. And for Nell, for Silent Nell, she did the strangest, gentlest thing. She started talking to herself, out loud, while she worked. Narrating the small business of the day. Now we'll let the bread rise. And isn't that a fine sound the kettle makes? And look at that. The cat's found the warm spot already. A steady, low, easy stream of words. Asking nothing, expecting nothing. Just filling the silence with something soft so a child who'd gone quiet in a too loud world might learn the room was safe to make noise in again. She didn't do it at Nell. She did it near Nell. There's a difference, and it's the whole difference in the world, and somehow that girl knew it. The friction came, though. I won't pretend it was smooth. Ruth tested her, left a pot to boil over to see what she'd do, sassed her once about how Mama used to make the cornbread, hard and sharp, watching for the new woman to flinch or snap. Adeline didn't snap. She said, "Then I expect your Mama made better cornbread than I do, and I'd be glad if you'd show me her way." And she meant it, and she let Ruth teach her, and she made the cornbread Mara's way after that every time, even when it was more trouble. She kept the dead woman's recipe alive in her own hands. I don't think Ruth ever got over that. I think that's the day the war ended, though neither of them would have called it a war. Asa was harder. Asa needed a fight, and she wouldn't give him one. 3 weeks in, he said the cruel thing children say when they want to make you leave so it'll hurt less than you leaving on your own. He stood in the kitchen and he said, "You're not my ma. You're just a woman my pa bought because nobody else wanted you." The room went still. Caleb wasn't there. It was just me at the table and the children and her. Adeline put down the spoon, and she looked at that furious, shaking 9-year-old boy, and she didn't get angry and she didn't cry, and what she said I'll remember to my grave. "You're right," she said. "Nobody wanted me, that's true, and you didn't want me either, and you've got better reason than most." She crouched down to his level. "But I'm here now, and I'm not leaving, so you can spend your strength hatting me and I'll understand it and I won't hold it against you. Or you can save it. Because winter's coming, Asa, and this family's going to need every bit of strength it's got, and I'd rather you on my side than against me. Either way, I'm staying. Asa's face did a thing then. It cracked. Just for a second the anger slipped, and underneath it was a little boy who'd been holding a wall up alone for 2 years and was so tired. And then he slammed the anger back down and ran out. But he ran out crying, and that was new, because Asa hadn't let anybody see him cry in 2 years, and you can't uncry in front of somebody. A door had opened a crack. It was about a month in that I found out why they'd slept in the hall. There'd been a woman before. Not a wife. A housekeeper Caleb had hired the first winter, a Mrs. Dale, a hard, practical woman who'd come to cook and clean for wages. And she'd lasted 6 weeks, and then she'd left in the night without a word, took her pay and walked out before dawn and was gone when the children woke. Just gone. No goodbye. Another grown woman who'd come into their lives and then vanished while they slept. So when Adeline came, the children, without telling their father, without telling anybody, had made a pact. Ruth told Adeline this herself much later, but I'll tell it now so you understand. They'd decided to guard her, to sleep across her door so that if she tried to slip away in the night the way Mrs. Dale had, the way their mother had, because to a 5-year-old, death and leaving in the night are the same crime, they'd wake. They'd catch her. They'd have a chance to ask her to stay. They weren't keeping her out. They were keeping her in. Those 3 grieving children, who the whole world thought would reject the stranger their father brought home, they'd looked at her that first night and decided, in the desperate arithmetic of children who have lost too much, that they could not survive losing one more person who slept in their house. So they'd guarded the only thing they had left to guard. They welcomed her the only way they knew how, by refusing, with their small bodies across a cold floor, to let her go. That's the unexpected welcome. That's the thing I've carried 20 years. Not warmth, not flowers, not open arms. 3 children lying across a threshold in the dark, terrified, holding the door so the new mother couldn't disappear. And the cruelest part, the part that nearly ended it all, is that Adeline almost did leave. And it wasn't her fault. It was Caleb's, Caleb trying to be a good man. Because somewhere in that second month, Caleb Hartley got it into his head that he'd done her a wrong, that he'd taken a young woman and trapped her in a house of grief over a bargain she'd had no say in. And being the decent, broken man he was, he came to her one evening on the porch. I was nearby, fixing a harness. They didn't see me, and he told her she was free. I had no right, he said, to send for you like an order from a catalog. You're 19 years old, you didn't choose this. I won't keep a woman like a debt. His voice was rough. There's a stage Thursday. I'll pay your passage home or anywhere you want to go, and no man here will think the less of you. You're free to go, Adeline, I release you. And he meant it as a kindness. The poor fool meant it as the kindest thing he had. And I watched her face in the porch light, and I saw it land like a blow. Because what Adeline heard, what the girl her family could spare, the girl nobody wanted, the girl handed off like a debt heard, was, you can go. We don't need you either. You're free, which means you're not necessary, which means you're alone again. She didn't cry. She said, I see. Thank you, Mr. Hartley, I'll think on it. And she went inside. And here's the morally heavy thing, the choice the whole story turns on. Because that night Adeline packed her carpet bag. I know because Ruth told me. The girl had a real way out, a decent man offering her freedom and passage and no shame. She could have gone back east, tried for a better marriage, a kinder life, a place where she wasn't a stranger raising another woman's grieving children in a house of ghosts. Nobody would have blamed her. She had every reason in the world to take that Thursday stage. She packed her bag, and she sat on the small bed in the back room with it packed at her feet, and she made herself decide. And then she heard it, through the wall, Nell, 5-year-old silent Nell who hadn't made a sound in 2 years. Adeline heard her in the next room whimpering in her sleep. A small, frightened, wordless sound. A nightmare. The sound of a child reaching for someone who isn't there. Ruth said Adeline came out of her room in her nightgown and went to Nell's bed and sat down on the edge of it and put her hand on the child's back, that steady warm pressure, and stayed there. Didn't pick her up, didn't wake her. Just put her hand there so the little one would feel, even in sleep, even in the dark, that the room was not empty. That someone had heard, that someone had come. And she sat there till the whimpering stopped, and the child's breathing went soft and even. And then Adeline Crane went back to her room and unpacked her bag. She never told Caleb about the stage, she just didn't take it. Thursday came and went, and she was still there scrubbing the corners and narrating the bread to a silent child, and Caleb wouldn't know for years that she'd chosen them. Not him, she barely knew him yet. The children. She'd chosen the children. She'd looked at the one clear exit from the worst bargain a woman ever got, and she'd closed it with her own hand, because somewhere in that house, a child she owed nothing to had made a frightened sound in the dark and reached for her. I told you she was made of iron. I was wrong. Iron breaks. She was made of something that bends and holds. Winter came on hard that year, and winter in this country is where the bargains all come due. I've seen Montana winters that killed men who knew better. This was shaping up to be one. The wind came down off the high country and the temperature dropped till the nails in the barn wall popped like gunshots in the night, and the cattle huddled and the world went white and silent and dangerous. We'd brought the stock in clothes. We'd laid in wood. We were as ready as a poor ranch can be, which is to say not ready enough, but we'd held through worse. By December, the house had changed. I want you to understand that before I tell you the hard part. By December, a sack carried wood for Adeline without being asked and pretended it was his own idea. Ruth had started calling her Addie, which had taken 3 months, and which made Caleb's eyes go bright the first time he heard it. The cornbread came out Mara's way. There was laughter in the kitchen sometimes, short, surprised laughter, like the family was relearning a language it had forgotten. And Caleb, slow, careful, like a man crossing river ice, Caleb had begun to look at his wife. To really look at her, to say more than 2 words. They weren't in love yet, but they were in something. They'd started taking coffee together after the children slept, just sitting, just being 2 tired people in the same warm room, and that's where it starts, isn't it? That's where it always starts. Only Nell still hadn't spoken. She'd come miles in every other way. She climbed in Addie's lap now. She brought Addie her drawings, and the drawings had changed. The stick figure mother in the corner had started holding hands with a new stick figure, and Addie had cried over that one in the pantry where nobody could see. But the words wouldn't come. 2 years of silence sat in that little girl like a stone, and we'd all near given up hoping it would move. Then came the night of the storm. It was the worst night of the winter, and we didn't see it coming because Nell didn't tell anybody where she was going. That's the thing about a silent child. They can't call out. They can't be called back. Here's what we pieced together after. It was Mara's birthday. Caleb had said it that morning, soft, not thinking your mama would have been 31 today, and Nell had heard it. And that evening in the gathering dark, with the first flakes of the big storm starting to fall, 5-year-old Nell had slipped out the kitchen door in nothing but her dress and her shoes, carrying her one-eyed doll, and walked up the hill behind the house, to the grave. To bring her mother something for her birthday, the way you do, the way a child does, because nobody had taught her that you stop doing that the dead don't have birthdays you can walk to. We didn't miss her till full dark. Ruth went to put her to bed, and the bed was empty. I have never in my life seen a house come apart so fast. Caleb went white, and then he was moving, throwing on his coat, and the wind outside had come up to a scream, and the snow had gone sideways, and you could not see the barn from the porch. You could not see 10 feet. A grown man could die in that, lost between his own outbuildings. A 5-year-old child had been out in it for 2 hours. Caleb was half out the door, calling her name into a wind that ate the sound, and I was right behind him, and Adeline. Adeline grabbed my arm, and she said, fast and clear, "The hill. Caleb, the hill shall have gone to Mara," because she'd understood the birthday before any of us. She'd put it together in a half-second while the rest of us were still drowning in panic. And she was right. God help us, she was right. We went up the hill. All of us who could, me and Caleb and Adeline, with Ruth holding a sab back at the house screaming to come, lanterns that the wind near tore out of our hands, calling a name into a storm that swallowed it whole. And I'll tell you, in that white howling dark, I lost my faith for about 4 minutes. I thought we were going to find a thing on that hill that would break this family for good and final this time. I thought, she came all this way, that girl, she chose them, she stayed, and the world's going to take the littlest one anyway, the way it takes everything. I thought it and I hated thinking it and I couldn't stop. It was Adeline who found her. She found her because she didn't go to the grave straight. She thought like the child, she thought. A little one, cold, scared, 2 hours in the dark, she wouldn't still be standing at the grave. She'd have tried to come home and gotten turned around. So Adeline didn't search the hilltop. She searched the way down, the wrong ways down, the ways a frightened child would wander, and she found Nell curled at the bottom of the draw against a deadfall log, half covered in snow, the doll still in her arms, not moving. I heard Adeline scream Caleb's name, and we came running, and the girl scooped that child up off the frozen ground, and she was already running for the house with her, already tearing her own coat off to wrap her, and Nell's lips were blue, and her little body was limp and cold as the ground she'd lain on. And I thought, I'll be honest with you, I thought we were too late. What happened in that house that night I won't dress up because it doesn't need it. They got her by the stove. Adeline got the wet things off her and got her against her own bare skin under every blanket in the house, the oldest trick there is, a living body's warmth, and she held that cold child against her heart, and she did not let go for 6 hours. Caleb on one side, Adeline on the other, Ruth keeping the fire roaring, Asa heating stones to tuck around them. The whole broken family, pressed in close around the littlest one, pouring every degree of warmth they had into her. And Adeline talked, the whole night low and steady, that same gentle stream she'd been pouring near that child for months. I've got you, you're home now, we found you. You're not alone, I'm right here, I'm not going anywhere. I've got you, over and over into the child's hair, while the storm screamed against the shutters and we waited to find out if a 5-year-old's heart was stronger than a Montana night. The color came back to Nell sometime past 3. The blue went out of her lips and her breathing deepened and her little hands, which had been like ice, went warm. And she stopped being a thing we were losing and started being a child who was sleeping. I went out to the porch when I was sure, and I stood in the cold, and I cried like I haven't cried since Sarah, and I'm not ashamed to put it down. It was near dawn when Nell woke. The storm had blown itself out, that gray, ringing, exhausted quiet that comes after. The fire was low. Nell was lying against Adeline with the blankets up to her chin, and she opened her eyes, and she looked up at the face of the woman who'd carried her out of the dark. And she said, Mama. 2 years of silence, and that's the word that broke it. One word, cracked and small, in a voice none of us had heard since she was 3. Mama. To Adeline. Not to a memory, not to the woman on the hill. To the one who'd come down into the draw in a screaming storm and found her and held her against a beating heart all night and said I'm not going anywhere until it was true. Adeline went absolutely still. I watched her face. She didn't correct the child. She didn't say I'm not your mama. She'd said that her first night, hadn't she? I'm not here to take anyone's place. But a thing had happened across these months that was bigger than taking a place. That was about a place being made new by a child's own choosing. Adeline's whole face came apart and put itself back together, and she pressed her lips to Nell's forehead and she said, so quiet I almost didn't catch it. I'm here, baby, I'm here. Caleb made a sound I won't try to describe. Ruth had her hand over her mouth. Asa turned his face away so we wouldn't see, 2 years too late to hide it from anyone. And that's near the end of what I can tell you straight, because what I remember after is mostly just the gray light coming up in that warm, wrecked kitchen, and the 5 of them tangled together by the dying fire, and the great relieved silence of people who have been allowed, against all odds, to keep what they have. I'll tell you they made it. The ranch nearly didn't. That spring the bank came sniffing and the calves came hard, and there were nights I counted our troubles instead of our cattle, and the troubles ran longer. The world wasn't done with that family. It never is. But I'll tell you what I saw the first morning after the storm when I went up to the house to check the stove. Same as that first night. Same hall. Same door. Only this time, the children weren't sleeping across her threshold to keep her from leaving. This time the door to the back room stood open, and that small bed was empty, neatly made, the borrowed coat long since hers and hanging where she'd hung it the first night. Because Adeline Crane didn't sleep in the back room anymore. I didn't go and look where she slept instead. A man's got a right to keep some things to himself, and that family had earned the dark of their own front room. I just banked the stove, like I'd come to do, and I stood a minute in that quiet house that had learned how to breathe again. I took out my watch out of habit. Stopped at midnight 9 years, the night I lost mine. And I looked at its dead face in the gray morning light, in that warm, full house that had found a way to live, and for the first time in all those years,